Hi, I'm Eric Lubau, and welcome to Beyond the Belt. This is a conversation with Bryan Rumble, a black belt out of Ontario, Canada. Bryan is a clinical epidemiologist who focuses his work on genital urinary cancers. Bryan has also had a lifelong fascination with science fiction and fantasy, both in written form as well as tabletop games, and we discussed it all. We did have some challenges with the internet connection and did our best during the editing process to make it as unimpactful as possible, but please forgive us, and I hope you still enjoy our chat as much as I did. Well, what was it like for you to get your black belt?
It was something that I think everybody that trains imagines the day it arrives. And I kept wondering what it was going to be like, who was going to be there. And then it happened. And I kind of knew that it was going to happen. I don't see my instructor all that often. He's maybe in the province once a year, if that. But because he is a little older and he wasn't traveling through the pandemic, I haven't seen him since 2019, I think, in person. I still communicate with him, but it was a big seminar. He was there. He was promoting my students, and we'd had a discussion on where we thought everybody was. And then at the end, I was awarded with my black belt, and I had thought, maybe tonight will be the night. This was in 2016, but if it wasn't, it was okay, because there's been times in the past that I've felt he had a really high bar, and some people that I thought in the organization, other instructors that were purple for a long time, I thought tonight they'll get their brown, and then they didn't. So it was definitely a long road. But when I did get it, I felt very uncomfortable. Like, are you sure? Even though I'd been training for a long time, like it was a lot to live up to, I felt. And I could really feel the weight of the responsibility that I felt that I had, because I think that at some level, black belts are gatekeepers for the people that follow, and you want to at least meet the expectations that your instructor had for you and your students. So then I'm like, I don't know if I deserve this. My instructor was one of Carlson Gracie's senior students back in the day. My instructor started in the early 70s and has been training nonstop since then. And he would be telling us stories about the old days and how hard the training was. And I just felt a lot of weight when I got my brown belt. One of the guys in the organization messaged me and he said, "Welcome to the dark side," because the brown is the next step. And then you think, how long am I going to be brown? I don't think I've been brown long enough. Purples are still catching me sometimes and things like that. But I think that that's kind of ancillary to the what a black belt means. And I think that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructors put uh, undeserved weight on what the black belt means in a way that other coaches in other sports don't do. And I'm an older guy. I was 50 in 2016 when I got my black belt. And I think I've really had to give myself permission to get old and still be able to teach and train. Uh, I've lowered my expectations for my own physical performance. But the black belt, I don't know if I've answered the question the way that you were expecting me to.
There is no
How it felt.
expectation.
Okay. I felt that there was a large weight on my shoulders, where the responsibility was now, I wasn't being gate capped. I don't even think that's the right term. I I I came from the position of maybe quality control, where I was being quality controlled, to I was now one of the people that was going to be in a quality control position. So from that point on, my responsibility was to teach the art and make sure that my students all met minimum standard for the belt level that they were at.
Did you feel qualified to do that, or was that part of the giving yourself permission thing?
Well, the giving myself permission thing, possibly. Um, the giving myself permission thing, though, specifically, is I'm going to be 58 soon, and I've been very hard on my body through these years, like not tapping to things I probably should have, and just teaching and training through injuries, and then they don't heal or they take long to heal. But, like a lot of other guys my age that have done this for uh 28 years now. I've had knee surgery. I have a bad elbow. It dislocates quite often. I have bad shoulders, and it's giving myself permission to not be great in some roles anymore. Um, Sometimes I'll go into knee on belly and my right hip will light up. Like it's protesting just the position, not even fighting a submission off, just me going into knee on belly on somebody else sometimes hurts me. So I've given myself permission to not be great in some roles and not be great in some positions. And I acknowledge that my best years are behind me, but the art still has a lot to offer beyond constantly beating people and dominating them physically. I mean, when I was younger and I discovered this, I was in my late 20s, and now I'm in my late 50s. And I know that I'm not the guy I was when I was 30, but that's okay. We all do get older. And now it's more about developing students and, that quality control thing. I want to make sure that my students uh, are performing well at their level. So if they compete, I want my blue belts to be doing well at, blue belt, purple belt, brown belt. And I do have some black belts now, which is nice.
Do you feel like there's a lesson in there that you want to kind of impart to your students? Like, don't do as I did. Don't destroy your body. Or are you kind of willing to let people
Yeah,
learn that lesson for themselves?
yes, there is a lesson there. And the lesson is you can't win training roles. And I know that everybody keeps score in their head, like he got me last time, or I always get this guy, or whatever. But that is not what training jujitsu should be about. Save that mentality for actual competition. I tell my guys all the time, you cannot win warm up. You cannot win training roles. Like, don't even keep track. Use them as an opportunity to try to do the things that we've been working on in class. That new technique that I taught, and you said, oh, that's fantastic. I want to see you actually try it, not do the same old that you always do because you're good at it. You should have some depth and breadth to your knowledge and what you actually do. And I mean, in competition, like in high level judo, most guys are known for one or two techniques. And the question is, who's going to get their favorite technique off first? And then the match is over. And save that reduction for competition. But in training, you should be going deep and wide. So that's it.
When I teach a move and I do the rolling with folks after the drilling session, I always try to put myself in the position where they can execute the move, and hopefully, like fingers crossed, they are attempting it on me. And if they do it, I will let them get it 100% of the time if they do it like reasonably well. But
Yeah,
I'm
and
with you, like positive reinforcement.
yeah, and that's how learning takes place. So it's kind of in stages, right? They have to see it. So then if they see that the position is open there, then they can start moving into isolating something, whether it's a choke or a limb, and then slowly, methodically advancing their position until they can make the attempt. And yes, I hear that, especially if you're developing talent, because I think that if you crush people too much at the beginning, it can really demoralize them. And then they're like, what am I doing here? This is a horrible thing to do on my evenings. I could be watching TV or whatever. Although I do something when people first start at my club the first night, they're gonna have a bad time. And some people love this. I'm kind of known for it in the area. And other, like even one of my students who's a black belt started a club and he said, I'm not doing this with my guys. But
I really wanted to ask you about this because I've heard this about you. So can you talk a little bit about this?
Okay, so it was probably from Matt, right?
It was from John.
Okay.
John Ethier.
Oh, okay. So I do something called the Gauntlet. And on everybody's first night, they have to go. So we do our warm up, and I had to switch it because I know most clubs roll at the end of class. And what I found out was people would dip out and they would leave before. I think that the rolling, like the actual thoughtful attempts at applying jujitsu, is very important. And I'm not one for calisthenics. So I know that some clubs do, like, you got an hour and a half class, the first half hour is warm up. I don't do that. We start rolling and we start cold because I think that at the heart, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu has to be something accessible as a method of self defense. And if you want to know what your body's capable of doing cold, from a cold start, like you were walking through the mall and you're grabbed from behind, or you're in the parking lot, you're not going to be doing the fancy stuff. It's going to be a back to basics. This is what will work cold. So the first few rules tell you a lot about what your body's capable of doing cold. So we always start warming up with rolls, live rolls. I always tell people, like, ease into it. You know your body. You don't want to get hurt in your first roll. So just stick to basics, stick to what works. So we do that. And then in between me teaching technique and the warm up, which is all rolls, everybody that's new and it's their first night does what I call the gauntlet. And this came from my Japanese jiu-jitsu instructor, did something like this. And it's a test, it's a gut check. They go through everybody. It's 2 minutes of first submission. So if they get submitted quick, that's the end of the roll. I tell people, like, don't get hurt, but don't be a little bitch. Like, don't tap out to position. Don't tap out because you think that you're in trouble. Actually tap out to something legitimate. And I do it for a couple reasons. One, I think that males, like, I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a funny poll. I think The Onion did it, but it was the number of men who thought that they could fight a bear. And it was like, right? So I think that every guy on the planet is walking around thinking, yeah, when it comes down to it, I can take care of myself. And I think that their first Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class is a real face validity check to show them that you're not quite as tough as you thought you were. And, I've had women students in the back and, in the past, and, a female purple belt will destroy most untrained guys, even if the guy is stronger than them. They just don't understand fighting at a level that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu people do. And I also do it to weed out, I don't want to say the weak, but the people that won't be there in a month, because I don't teach to pay my bills. I have a lot of freedom. So I don't have to teach anybody that I don't think is interested in actually toughing it out and learning the art. So if anybody has any doubts on whether Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is for them, this will let them know. Because I've had people that started this gauntlet that I do and asked to go get a drink, and then they never come back. They grab their stuff in the change room and they sneak out the door. I've had that happen a lot of times. Like, people throw up, they run outside and they're puking everywhere because most people just don't push themselves into that space. So not only are they just physically exhausted, they're absolutely getting dominated by everybody. And then once you are done, you've passed the test. Like, everybody gets up and everybody claps and gives them a round of applause. Everybody shakes their hand, and then we have our break. And they feel like I survived something. I accomplished something. And I think that most people avoid doing difficult things in life. A lot of people take the easily traveled path, like the poem, very few people will do hard things, especially as an adult. Like, they're like, I've done all this. I played, baseball or football, or here it would be minor hockey. I've done all that, but as an adult, we don't have a lot of physical challenges left. And this is hard. And I think that maybe we can get into this later, but I think martial arts at its heart is an allegory for life. And the challenges that we face on the mats reflect the challenges that we face in regular life. And you can either collapse in the face of difficult things, or you can step up and achieve stuff. I find that people that can tough out Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and do the training and work through the injuries and achieve some rank and some knowledge, it kind of has this halo effect that it bubbles out into their other life, personal relationships, work, other things, because you get this physical and mental fortitude, and you believe, like, if I can do the gauntlet, I can do anything. And then I tell people, like, the first night you are not going to have a good time. It's going to suck, but it's going to be the worst night here. Everything else is going to be easier. And then I've seen people that they've done their gauntlet, and then a week later another new guy comes and they're just like so excited because they're on the other side of the experience. But it is a team building thing, even though it does suck for your first night.
That's fascinating because I'm listening to that and I'm like, wow, I would hate doing that. And I'm
Yeah.
somebody who's like been doing martial arts for, almost 40 years in some form. And I've been in combat. I've been in like really stressful situations. And I listen to that and I'm like, wow, I don't like the idea of throwing someone in unprepared. Um, because I have plenty of students, and I'm sure you do, who would happily do that, just not on the first night. And I think it's an interesting like bar to set for people. Um, and I wonder how many people would have stuck it out that you were like, nope, you didn't survive the first night.
Yeah, that I
Uh,
scared away. And
yeah,
that's why one of my black belts doesn't do it, because
yeah,
he's like, that's a terrible thing to do to people. And I
yeah,
think that it's very polarized. People either see the value in it, because a lot of people have said, like, it's different. You're the only club that I know that does anything like this. But it does serve as a good face validity check for who's willing to stick around. Because this is, for most people, I think that Brazilian Jiu Jitsu physically is the hardest thing they will ever do in their life. And you get people from all walks. Not everybody has a physical job. Although I've got a couple guys that are like landscapers and construction, and like you grip up with them and what that they're not doing what I do all day.
they're not
Uh,
typing.
yeah, they're not just typing and thinking and pondering things.
Yeah,
They're actually out there working, but they're still just done at the end of the class. And then there's the other ones that are like, it's just hazing, it's ridiculous, it's juvenile, somebody's going to get hurt. Nobody's ever gotten hurt. And I tell people, like, your goal isn't to hurt them. Your goal is to show them that, one, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu works, and it works really, really well. And two, they are not as tough as they thought they were. And I think that reality check a lot of guys need. Like, it would be nice if you could just hold that mirror up and show people, and maybe in the future we can make it so that fewer than 75% of all adult males think that they could beat a bear in a fight, because
yeah,
that's just a ridiculous idea. Like, I've done Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for decades, and I think I have zero chance against an adult bear.
yeah.
you know
Same.
I may get lucky and just not get killed, but I am not going to be submitting him with no rear naked
Yeah.
choke, wearing him as a cloak later.
I think the thing that really like that gets me about it is I have a bunch of students who and people that not, they started training even before me at this gym who are building their confidence bit by bit, and this would have scared them off and they never would have gotten to the point where they're at now, which some of them are, purple belts, blue belts and purple belts. But if they had started with that at the low level of confidence they had, they wouldn't have made it. So I
Fact.
don't disagree necessarily with it completely, but I think you do potentially scare off some people who could use the confidence building.
Yeah, I absolutely acknowledge that. And that is a limitation of my methodology. The thing is that I do have limited mat space. I only have so much head space to keep track of my students. I have a number that I would like to have, and no more. And there, I would rather have students that I can really focus on and keep for the long term and develop. And my classes are small. and every single student gets personal attention in class. When I go around after I teach a technique, I will spend time with the dyad or the three of them and make sure that everybody has the mechanics of the technique down, because you're going to get faster and smoother as you do it over time. But I have like the beats of the technique in my head. Like I want to see 1, 2, 3, 4. And I don't leave that group until I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever the beats of the technique are. And then I go over to the next group. So I'll show a technique, and depending on how involved it is and how, sometimes people are, I've worked all day and I'm not, you've taught more than 3 things and I'm starting to lose it. But I do make sure that everybody understands the technique before I move on. And that is a limiting factor. And I don't really make any money doing this. I really do it for the love of teaching, and I don't have to rely on it to pay my bills, which does give me the freedom to say there are some people that I don't want to train because I don't have the time in my day or the time left to develop people that aren't tough enough to handle the training.
Yeah, I like the mentality. I appreciate that you acknowledge that there are limitations in it. I feel like
Oh
that's
yeah.
not something everybody is willing to do. But if you're
Yeah.
like, hey, that's the limitation, I acknowledge it, and this is what I want out of it. Like, yeah, hey, more power to you.
Yeah, that is the price that I pay. And I'm willing to do that. Like, it's rare for me. I have had female students in the past, but it's the way I teach is generally not fun for female students. And I don't teach kids because I just don't have the patience. And I think that a lot of it is just kind of, I think it's kind of babysitting for the parents. Like, they can send their kids somewhere for a couple hours a few times a week. And I don't know, there will be if you did a Venn diagram, there would be a small subset that will continue on through adults. Um, and they're worth teaching. But the way I do it is I only have to focus on that small portion of the Venn
Yeah,
diagram. And
that makes sense.
they're the people in the long haul. And like, you do know Matt, but he did say that one thing that he noticed about my club was year after year when pics were posted from seminars, it was the same people. Like I do retain students for the long haul. The average tenure at my club for some, like I've got one guy who's been with me for over 20 years. Um, and another one that's fairly close. And some guys started when they were in their late teens, early 20s, and like 10, 15 years later they're still there in the picks. So that makes me happy, because then I tell my students, you can train anywhere. Like I really don't care. You want to go visit another club, have at it. And if you think that you are going to get a better jiu-jitsu experience there, that's awesome for you. I'm so glad that you were my student for all that time. And if it's time to move on for you, I want you to just be the best guy you can be. So
I love
that's
that. That's a super healthy mentality. Like, I think that's
yeah.
great.
Right. And I think a lot of the unhealthy things about student retention and don't train there, I think it, for most people, it comes down to it's either instructor ego or money. They see that, there's 100 and whatever dollars a month walking out the door and they may never come back. And now they got to work to get another student. I don't care about any of that. Um, I just care about teaching, training, developing students for the future, and hopefully, um, I think of it as a generational thing. I was lucky enough that I did get to train with Carlson Gracie Sr. twice before he passed, but my student was like the first gen. So I'm second. My students would be third. And I'm just hoping that I can teach something that would be meeting the standard of them.
I'm sure it is. I mean, I've rolled with some of your students with like they do know what they're doing.
Oh, okay. Well, that's nice to hear.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how good of a judge I can be, but from the roles I've had, yes, they do know what they're doing. So
Nice.
you don't make most of your money from teaching jujitsu. You're a clinical epidemiologist, as you told me. Can you just describe a little bit about what that is and how you got interested in it?
Sure. So, clinical epidemiologist is kind of the lesser known um, lesser known compared to the public health epidemiologist. So when somebody says that they're an epidemiologist, almost all of them are public health epidemiologists. So public health epidemiologists deal with tracking and trending mostly infectious diseases in populations. So it would be things like uh, COVID would be an example of it, SARS, monkeypox, any outbreak, Lyme's disease, bird flu, things like that, swine flu. And they will track and trend and try to identify where it started, find the patient zero, and try to get some samples, figure out some kind of vaccine or treatment for these people, or just after the fact go in and say, this is what happened, how did it happen? Clinical epidemiologists generally are looking at a smaller epidemiological problem. So I work in cancer research and mostly just genitourinary cancers. The big one would be prostate, and then renal, bladder, urothelial. Those are really the four that I've published on. And I work for one of the larger medical societies in the United States. I am a Canadian. I live in Canada, but I have a U.S.
I
work
won't hold
visa.
that against you.
Yeah, that's okay. I do spend a lot of time in the U.S., but I have a work visa, so I just go down as needed. Thanks to technology, we can all work wherever and live wherever for the most part, as long as your visas are in place, you have that freedom. So I've done this pretty much since I finished my undergrad. I did a undergraduate degree in health sciences, and then I did a master's with the Department of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics at a university that's not far from here. And I was working there full time. So that was very convenient. And then I've done some postgrads, but it's a lot of math. It's a lot of analysis.
How did you get interested in this?
How did I get interested in it? Well, I think that the cancer thing was, it's like everybody, there's nobody, people that are listening to this podcast, there's nobody who hasn't been touched by cancer. It's one of the biggest problems to solve in healthcare. And as our population ages, because it is correlated with cancer, so the older you are, the more likely you are to get it. I think that it's going to be a bigger problem in the future. So it's something that is important, and it's something for which we have a lot of accessible data, because there's the incidence and prevalence rates are fairly high. And the big four, which is like lung, colorectal, breast, prostate, the patients are living longer and healthier, but as the population ages, the numbers of people dealing with the burden of this disease is going to increase. And this is almost a global phenomenon, but especially in the West, because we live longer. And I found that as an interesting puzzle to solve. And because it is cancer, most of it is well funded enough that there's good data to do. So there's a lot of trials in this field and lots of things for me to do. So the job that I do is essentially looking at clinical trial data around a disease and then seeing what the results were. So in the early days, like 20 years ago, it would be, here's the gold standard treatment, here's the new experimental treatment. We had 10 trials that gave A and B, and who did better. And then you can kind of pool all of those numbers together and come up with this overall estimate of treatment effectiveness. Yeah, so if you pool all of the data, which is stats talk for doing a meta-analysis. So
Yep.
if I take 10 trials, I can actually collapse the data as if it was one large trial with that number of patients. One group got treatment A, one group got treatment B, and then there will be an overall estimate of treatment effect. And you can kind of see whether there was a clear difference, no difference, or it favored one or the other. And then you can make some recommendations around that. So the real value add is we will make recommendations on how this type of cancer should be treated or what the optimum ones are for patients, because patients with cancer are often also overweight, or they're diabetic, or they have COPD or some other comorbidity. And even though a healthy patient who's included in a trial might have done better on B, maybe A is better for them. So the trial data alone won't tell you what you should do for any given patient. That kind of is the art of medicine. If the data alone could tell you what you could do, you wouldn't need doctors. They could just say, "Oh, we did a trial A versus B. B was better, so everybody gets B." Well, that might not be true. There could be patient subtypes that would still do better on A, and then you explain it, so it's explained in the narrative what you should do and or things to think about. So I find that work really interesting because I didn't go to medical school. I'm not, well, my master's was from a medical school, but I'm not an MD. So I don't see patients, I don't practice medicine, but I've had a very large impact on how patients are treated that have certain cancers because of the research, because it's published, and then those recommendations are followed. Sometimes they're adopted for insurers will only cover things that are recommended in a guideline. So I find that very satisfying.
So I took a look through some of your publications, and you've got nearly 100 of them according to PubMed and ResearchGate. It varies a little bit between them. What's like the most surprising thing that you've uncovered through this, nearly 100 publications on genitourinary cancers?
Sure. Actually, I was just talking about this a few days ago, but when I first started, so everybody knows what the placebo effect is, right?
I mean, a quick explanation wouldn't hurt for people who don't, but yeah.
Sure. So placebo is a modern word, but it means for to please. So it's something that you give somebody that is supposed to have no therapeutic value. And it's because when you really want it blinded. So if I was doing a trial and I said, I'm going to be comparing nothing at all versus something, a lot of people will believe that they are doing better and will report like lesser symptoms, or the disease has not progressed or even cured if you give them something, because it's different. So people can talk themselves into thinking that there's an effect when there isn't. So a placebo trial is usually where you get something, but it's nothing. So both groups are getting something. And then if they both think that there's an extra effect on top of what they got because of it, it'll even out between the two groups, because both of them got something, even though one was a drug and one was a sugared tablet or whatever the placebo is. Even in surgical trials, they will sometimes do sham surgeries where they will make a cut like they did do a surgery, even if you didn't get the surgery, just to see. But this was one of the first guidelines that I ever did. So this is over 20 years ago. And it was a trial from China. And there were people, I think that 4 people out of about 50 in the no treatment arm died from grade 3-4 adverse effects from a treatment that they never received. So the placebo effect is actually so powerful that if you think that you're having grade 3-4 toxicity, like nausea, vomiting, you can't keep anything down from this treatment that you've received, it can kill you even if you were in the no treatment arm and you received a.
Well, that's terrifying.
Yeah, so that but I think it speaks to the power of the human brain. So for some of those people though, they may have actually had a curative effect, like the opposite, and they received no treatment. So they always say the power positive, keep thinking positive, don't give up. People that are really, really sick will hear that. Just don't give up, keep thinking positive. I think that there's a lot of merit to that.
You said that you've had some real impact, like on some of the people, on some of the progress and procedures. Is there anything that some of your publications or some of your research have turned into real things, like real procedural changes, real solutions? Is there any of those?
Yes, all of them. I
Oh,
think
okay.
all of, yeah, because they all change practice. So when we publish a guideline, we make recommendations for what you should do, but it's always in light of new research. So the crazy thing, well, the awesome thing about science is it continually marches on. So the things that we know now will be better fleshed out or often invalidated in the future. So when I publish a guideline, these are new recommendations for the most part. There's something new in all of them that does change practice. So all of the stuff that I do, I believe changes practice in some way. There's some a completely new class of drugs included, or a new drug that is a lot better than what was available previously. And the recommendations account for that. So I think that all of them are practice changing and have merit.
Was there like a specific moment where you're like, oh shit, the things that I do really do change the way people work or how many people survive?
Yeah, the first one, and one of the first ones that I did, it was on follow up for metastatic colorectal cancer treatment. And a lot of times people will focus on the treatment, but not surveillance and follow up. So I published a paper with a older clinician from the area. His name was Alvaro Figueredo, and I think it's my most cited paper ever. And it's follow up to advanced colorectal cancer. And it keeps getting picked up because we included things that are applicable no matter where you live in the world. So if you are in, Canada, the United States, Western Europe, you have world-class medical systems. You have the most drugs that are approved and are covered under local insurance, etc. But we were doing this guideline, and he was very aware that not everybody on the planet has access to the most recent things that are out there. And in the developing world, there's a drug that's still used in colorectal cancer treatment called levamisole, and it's antiparasitic. So the way it works, the biological mechanism, is if you give it to people, whether they have parasites or not, it has a immuno boosting effect. So if you give levamisole to patients that have anything else wrong with them, they get a better performing immune system, which has a measurable effect in cancer treatment. So it's like we kind of tiered it. So if you live in Canada, the US, or Western Europe, you can get oxaliplatin, irinotecan, bevacizumab. But if you don't, you can get the old standard, which is infusional 5-FU and levamisole, and you will receive a benefit on top of 5-FU alone, whether it's infusional or bolus. So that paper is still widely cited because we gave patients and clinicians options. Not everybody has everything available. And in some places, you are on your own to figure out how to pay for your treatment, whatever it is. So I think that's why it's still widely cited, widely read.
That's really cool that you have something like that in your in your like not in your back pocket that you've done and been a part of.
Yeah, and it was one of the earlier papers that I published too. It's yeah, and I think that, guidelines groups now are making sure that they're adding in things to account for not everybody has access to all of these things. Not everybody can afford all of these things. So give us some options. So, yeah, I think that's important.
If you had like unlimited resources, do you have like something that you would like to see researched? Some hope that you're like, man, this would be really great if somebody did look at this.
I think that cancer's well funded, so the research is very well funded. I think that I would like to see more research into cancers that have few patients. So there are some things that are basically ignored because there's not enough patients that will ever have this disease to warrant a pharmaceutical company or a country to put the money in. And I know that a lot of people have a lot of bad things to say about pharmaceutical companies, but the truth is that they will invest in many, many, many compounds to see if there's an effect, and most of them don't really show anything worth investigating further. So they do like their phase 1 studies. Okay, something's happening here, let's do some phase 2 research. Okay, out of 20, maybe 2 will go into human trials because they showed some efficacy or something. And all of those other trials cost money to produce. And then they might have 1 out of 20 that is a winner. And they have to kind of recoup their operating costs for running all of these other trials. So they focus on ones that they can market for a long time. They get like 25 years patent protection, and then it's anybody can make it as a generic and things like that. So they do have to make money. But if they weren't around, research would kind of come to a standstill. I know that you're American, and any American can look this up, but America used to fund a lot of pharmaceutical driven trials. So there would be government funding, state funding. That's almost all disappeared. They're not doing any trials really anymore. It's all pharmaceutical trials. So if it wasn't for the pharmaceutical trials, trying to figure out, what can we do about these? And they do mostly focus on the big 4: breast, lung, prostate, colorectal, because not only can they make the most money off of those, but also it's the one that has the most burden. Like the most number of patients have those 4 cancers. But if I had unlimited funds, I would probably put some research to lesser known cancers, because there is a disease burden and those patients will never have a trial, really. There's just no money to be made from it, or it's just so complicated that nobody knows where to start. But oftentimes some research will find through just a happy accident. For example, there's one cancer that there was no cure for. It was called gastrointestinal stromal tumor. And if you got it, now gastric and pancreatic are probably the most lethal cancers. And if you get diagnosed, it's probably metastatic, and you're looking at weeks to not, yeah, it's weeks. But there was one called GIST, gastrointestinal stromal tumor. There was no treatment for it at all. And
I had a
then
family member with that.
Okay, so 20 years ago, it was not, there was no good treatment at all. And in end stage human trials, like before it goes into an RCT, like a true RCT, they'll sometimes do phase 2 in somebody who is dying. So they've run out of treatment options. There's nothing left. But they will say your life expectancy is weeks, so can we try this because you have nothing left? We think that it may have an effect. So this person actually had 2 cancers, and they were both hitting them hard. The drug that they wanted to target the other one with, it didn't really touch it. But the next day when they woke up, essentially the stromal tumors had melted away with 1 treatment. So the standard treatment for this,
Wow.
for which we had nothing, nothing touched it, is now pretty much curable. And since I started in cancer treatment, I mean, it's very rare to hear about a man who will die of testicular cancer, even if it's metastatic. So Lance Armstrong was diagnosed, he had brain metastases from his testicular cancer, 6 cycles of the standard treatment, and he's still cycling. So like Lance Armstrong and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, GIST. So we've made big inroads in cancer treatment. One thing that I hear from people is, oh, they'll never cure cancer. And I'm like, well, I mean, you really shouldn't hear about a man passing from testicular cancer, even if it's metastatic. Now, he could have some rare, because cancer isn't like testicular cancer. It is your own cells. And everybody has their own DNA, and that comes with all of the variables. That's why in labs, they use monoclonal mice, because they're all the same DNA. So if you parse them out into 2 groups, you give one drug and you give one the other drug, you don't have to deal with variations in their genetic makeup. They're clones. So any difference in
Yeah.
outcome is probably the treatment that was administered. Where people are different. Like my cancer is not going to be the other person's cancer. It's just in me. So they call it like lung, prostate, colorectal, but it's my own cells working against me. So that genetic variability is really what confounds finding great treatments, because we also have to deal with everybody has a different genetic makeup, but then everybody has different comorbidities, different ages. All of those other things make it really difficult to detect the signal from the noise.
It's so fascinating how complex like we are as like just meat bags and
Yeah,
how much research goes into just the basics.
yeah, and there's so much that we really don't know. Like there are still some things that we work with, but we don't really understand the mechanism. Like, how does this? We're not sure what the biological mechanism is, but it seems to have an effect. So, yeah, there's so much to learn, and I do like the science part of it. And because I've had the classic training as a scientist, I understand that it's a method, uh, not a conclusion. So a lot of people that don't understand how it actually works is, well, I don't trust scientists because they did say this and now they're saying this. And I'm like, okay. But I mean, that's why you should pay attention to them, because it's not dogma. It's an ever
Yeah.
evolving thing, right? It's like a, yeah, it does ever evolve. It is not dogma. We will know more 2 years from now than we know today, and that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. The fact that scientists said something in the past and are saying something now shows that it does work. It does acquire knowledge.
Yeah. I wish more people understood that about the scientific method, but yes, that feels like a very basic understanding of the scientific method. Like sometimes you
Yeah.
learn something that you didn't know before, and then it gets added to the sum total of knowledge.
Right. Yeah. So that's my very brief TED talk on epistemology. But that is essentially, we do acquire knowledge, which changes how we look at the world. And sometimes, um, okay, I'm going to channel Thomas Kuhn here, but he came up with the term paradigm shift. He wrote a book called The uh, Structure of Scientific Revolution, I think. I don't know. I may be misremembering it, but he was the one that really talked about paradigm shift. But if I had a time machine and I went back to a gastrointestinal disorders conference in the 60s and I said, gastric ulcers are caused by a bacteria, not the overproduction of stomach acid due to stress, I would have been laughed out of the venue, because it was common knowledge that ulcers, which a lot of people had in those days, were caused by nerves. You need to relax, have a drink, take some time off. And it never got better because it was caused by this bacteria that they were full of. And it was really like 50 cents worth of antibiotics to get rid of it, but nobody treated it. When I was young in the 70s, half of our dads were walking around chewing on Tums constantly because their stomachs hurt from ulcers, and nobody was treating it. So that's an example of how we learned something that completely changed how we look at the biological mechanisms behind gastric cancer. But they had definitive proof at that time that it was caused by overproduction of stomach acid. Why were they overproducing stomach acid? Because they were stressed out. They had stressful jobs. They didn't take vacations. No, everybody was full of a bacteria that was eating their stomach lining called Heliobacter pylori.
Science is fantastic in that way.
Yeah, I wish more people had a basic science education, but maybe that's what I would do. If I had unlimited funds, it would be to do that, like a Khan Academy that everybody had to take the minimum standard. You want to be on the internet arguing with people? Take this course first.
I mean, honestly, I don't think that would be a horrible use of funds. Education is always is almost invariably a good investment.
Indeed.
So, shifting from science a little bit over to the science fiction side of things, you are also pretty into tabletop games.
I
I
am.
believe you
Yeah,
told me you started out in Dungeons and Dragons. Is that about the correct starting point for you?
it is. Yeah, back in '81, I was a teenager. I bought the box set for D&D, and that became an obsession. I was able to live out the stories or play through something like the stories that I'd read. So I think that I did talk about this. I was on a gaming podcast once, but they were talking about how you started in gaming. But I kind of drew the analogy. If you are familiar with the hero's journey, which is a literary method for creating a story, and it starts out with a call to adventure and a refusal and then a meeting a significant person who takes you through. The Lord of the Rings follows the hero's journey. A lot of epic things follow the hero's journey. Well, I
I
think that it
believe Rick and
happens
Morty, like Dan Harmon, really functionally focuses all the episodes on like the
on
hero's journey
the
kind of a thing.
yeah, and I think it's because it does speak to us as humans, going through this existence. And, like I was saying, that I think martial arts is an allegory for life. I also think role playing games are an allegory for life. And literature is an allegory for life. Like Tyrion Lannister said in one of the Song of Ice and Fire books, the man who reads lives 1,000 lives. The man who doesn't read only lives his one. And I think that that's true because you do remember these things and it does become a part of you, even if you can't remember specifics. Like there was an impact in that, the reading of that tale. But the thing that I found when I was looking back on my journey through role-playing games is that before I picked this thing up, there were primers in my life that I'd been exposed to. So I can remember the DC's The Warlord comic book I'd been picking up, and Conan comics, and I saw The Hobbit, which aired in 1977, the Rankin Bass British version of The Hobbit. And these things kind of primed me so that when I did encounter that Dungeons and Dragons box set and opened it up, I immediately understood that this was going to be a vehicle where I could create with other people our own stories that were like this. And have been playing pretty much ever since. I mean, I did take some time off when I was in university, and then, I had little kids, so I wasn't really leaving the house at night because um, my wife needed a break and we were both working when they were little and stuff. But I had MMOs to keep me occupied then. I mean, World of Warcraft, those things. But yeah, I think that
Can
D
you
and
just
D.
briefly explain for people who don't know what Dungeons and Dragons is, and like a real quick how you play it, because this might not be the
Sure.
same audience
Okay.
that
Okay.
has a lot of experience with tabletop games.
Okay. What? Everybody hasn't played D&D? So it's essentially a vehicle that you can use to create stories. So I think it more of collaborative storytelling than a competitive game. It's not like a board game. Nobody's supposed to be the overall winner. Sometimes you lose characters through the gameplay, but you create a persona, and the persona has attributes, and different games use different things, but D&D uses things like strength, dexterity, intelligence, wisdom, constitution, charisma. So that how strong you are, how smart you are, how fast you are, how tough you are, how wise you are, how your charisma is kind of like a combination of your physical appearance plus how you can talk to people and relate to people. And then these are randomly generated, and then you drop that fictitious person in a setting. So it is like a book in that way. And then there's somebody who is not running a player, and they're running everything else. All the people that you talk to, the world, they're adjudicating anything that could be randomized behind the scenes or in front of everybody. And then you go through a story. So there's different genres. I grew up playing D&D, and that's not a game that I have a lot of interest in playing anymore. I do play fantasy games, but I'm playing a game called Dungeon Crawl Classics, which is a very popular but rules light version of D&D. I play Traveler, which is a science fiction role playing game. I play Cyberpunk and Cyber Sprawl Classics, which are cyber type games. So if you enjoyed reading Neuromancer or The Diamond Age or anything like that, you would enjoy playing cyberpunk type games. There's horror games, Call of Cthulhu. So basically, any genre you can think of, like from movies or books or whatever, there's a role playing game around it. And I enjoy the social aspects of it. It's basically, you get together with some friends, you sit around a table, and you create a story and have a shared experience together. And that's what I really enjoy about it. So I did start playing D&D, and it was a lot of D&D like for 15 years, but then I discovered this wide world of other games, which is kind of like if you're giving, if you eat the same meal, you even if you really like it, at some point you're going to enjoy something else. So I don't really play D&D anymore. I play a lot of D&D like games. I really am enjoying science fiction.
Are there any specific themes or messages that you like to explore in your campaigns?
There are. So there, in the Blade Runner campaign, of course, the main theme is what does it mean to be human? And the players explore that. And the way the game's designed, if you use the pre-gens, two of them are full human, two of them are replicants, and they've kind of been partnered with each other. So, and everybody has a key memory that affects who they are as a person, kind of determines it. And the exploration should be leading them to be questioning who's the better human. So in the first movie, Tyrell Corporation's slogan was more human than human. And it's interesting to me because you can kind of see the penny drop where the player characters realize like we should not be hunting these people. They're people. They're not different from us. We've just been led to have a, the belief is that they are. And that realization I think is the part that's really cool about that game. The one things that I like is that through emergent play, some things that you didn't expect to arise will come out of it. So I kind of think like you would be aware of Robert E. Howard, the guy that wrote Conan. So he had other characters. He had like King Cole, Brock McFarlane, things. But when he started writing the Conan stories, he said that it wasn't so much him creating Conan stories as he felt this entity standing behind him dictating what Conan was doing, and he was just the vector between this entity and the typewriter. So people would report that they would be walking past the Howard home, and he lived in the front screened in porch area. That was like his bedroom. And they would hear him like banging on the typewriter, saying aloud every word as he typed it out because the story was kind of being created on the fly. And that's what I think is really cool about these. So you can start an adventure. There can be this NPC, a non-player character that the party has encountered, and they may be very minor. They're just going to introduce them to some hook that they can either pick up and run with or ignore or do later. But it may turn out that that NPC, just through play, becomes really important to the group for some reason or another. And then they kind of take off a life of their own. So I do like big themes. I like scaring my players. And not necessarily in a straight up horror game. But I think that if you're doing a good job and like if you're in no danger when you're reading a horror novel. But if the writer's done his job, you feel the fear, right? And I think that of all of these games, fantasy, science fiction, there has to be a horror aspect. For example, if you're some peasant farmer who has no education at all, and you are afraid of everything because there's things out in the woods that can kill you and eat you, and all of a sudden there's a hole in the ground where there was never one before, and you're going to grab a torch and go exploring, that should be terrifying because there's not good things there. There are going to be traumatic things down there that you're going to experience. That should be a terrifying thing for you to do. So I like scaring people. I like making them question their motivations. There's one adventure that I really like running because the players start out all for this one faction, and by the end, they're like, we are going to burn everything down. And there's a point in the adventure, and I look for it when they realize what's actually going on. And I ran this at a big gaming convention in March, and the one guy said, like, I'm going to be thinking about this for a while because you made us make moral choices that we were not ready to make. And then it's like, I've done my job. Um, I know that somebody has done some research in this field, and I heard it on a podcast, so I can't cite it, which I feel bad about because I should be able to cite the things that I say. But they were saying that if you read a story and you recall the events of that story, you know that it happened to another person, like it didn't happen to you. But if you have somebody recall something that happened to them in a role playing game and it didn't happen to them, but they will report it as if it happened to them, like, we did this, this happened, and this is what happened to me. And not only that, but if you hook them up to MRI or something that can scan the parts of their brain that fire up while they tell these stories, the image is really no different than if they're recalling an actual memory. So they can tell you about the trip that they took to the zoo when they were 5, and the same parts of the brain kind of fire while they're telling that story, or they can tell you what happened to their player character at the last gaming session, and the same things fire up, versus if they're telling what happened to Tyrion Lannister in book 3 of A Song of Ice and Fire. It's like they're real, and we process them and encode them like they're real. And I think that this just speaks to the fact that our memories aren't somewhere where we can just access them, and they're not perfect. So when we remember our past, it's like a story. We're the character in that story. And I think that that's it. Whether we're talking about life in general, our journey as martial artists, our journey through these fantastical worlds as gamers, we're all just stories in the end. And that's the thing that I think we need to realize, is just to be the best person you can be and make your story a good one.
So is your kind of assertion that we're all the main character in our story?
I think that we are the main character in our story and maybe in other people's stories as well. Like, maybe we're the main character in our spouses, the story of their life, in our children's, maybe our parents too. Like, I think that we do have, um, yeah, make everybody should be working hard to make their story good, whether it's on a table or in real life or on the mats.
I think that's a very like noble thing to want, is just for everyone to have a good story. And to be honest, that's how I spent a good portion of my 20s and 30s. I just do things because I was like, this will make a good story as long as I survive.
Yeah, yeah. I want, and then there is a point, when, unless there's a big historical record of you, but that's very few people,
Right.
right? At some point, the last person that knew me will be gone, and that's the last time my story will be told. And I just want the stories they tell to be good.
Yeah, and speaking of stories, I feel like we have a pretty big overlap in a lot of the books that we read. A little bit more on the science fiction and a little bit less on the fantasy side for me. But you read Murderbot, which
Oh yeah.
I happened to read almost. I read the first 6 in like a month and a half, and then I was waiting for months for the 7th. I mean, like what kind of books do you spend your time focused on?
So I read a lot of classic science fiction. So just recently, I've revisited some older Poul Anderson. I think I reread Neuromancer not that long ago. Some Heinlein. I'm a big Heinlein fan. But I do enjoy Murderbot. I think that Murderbot's a really good example of a modern work that's asking that question of what it means to be human, because the Murderbot is like a construct, had some organic material, but as an emergent property of it, it figures out that it's not an automaton, and it does have likes and dislikes, and it's trying to shed that impression of that self-image of I'm a murder bot. It refers to itself as murder bot,
Yeah.
but it's addicted to a television show that's been off the air for a while, and in its downtime, it just catches up on old issues of this television show that hasn't aired in years and stuff. It's a very human, non-human character.
I think it's beautiful the way they explore the relationship between like, you know, art and Murderbot themselves. I feel like it's just like two people trying to get to know each other that are just from different walks of life, and they're just not that. And it's like one's smarter significantly than the other, one has more capability significantly than the other, and yet they find a way to like spend time together and dislike each other and like each other. And I feel like allegorically, it's like very similar to the way humans interact. It's just like, no, these are just not humans. They're just human like.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, science fiction I think it's the best vehicle for exploring some of these things because you can use it as uh, like social commentary. Because a lot of early science fiction was just competency porn for teenage boys. Like they would have square-jawed heroes that always got the girl at the end, punched the alien in the face, saved the galaxy. Like the original, like Triplanetary, the origins of space opera as a genre.
Yeah.
And then the 60s and 70s had a lot of exploration on social constructs. Like The Left Hand of Darkness was looking at specifically gender issues and a lot of the things that we assign as gender roles at that time, because science fiction might be looking 10,000 years in the future, but it is grounded firmly in the year that it was published. But it was during the sexual revolution in the West, and they were looking specifically at gender issues. And it was like, well, what if people were both male and female? How would that change how society was organized? And would there be things like sexism, or would it be more egalitarian between the genders? And I thought that that was really influential. And it was written by a woman, and I don't know if a male at the time could have pulled it off because I think the closest example of a book like The Left Hand of Darkness written by a male was Heinlein's I Will Fear No Evil. Have you read that one?
I haven't, but I'm going to write
Okay,
it down for later.
yeah, it's I think that that might be the only example, and it was not the same book as The Left Hand of Darkness. So, and I'm a huge Heinlein fan, but there's some parts in that book that literally will cause a cringy physical reaction for me. And I loved it when I was like 14 or 15 when I first read it. But rereading some of the stuff that you loved as a child is dangerous because you find that you no longer love it as much. Sometimes you find out that you really don't like it at all.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's made me quite hesitant. I very rarely reread books. To be honest, the only books I've really reread as an adult are 1984 and Brave New World, which frankly I'm incredibly glad I reread, especially given sort of the world politics of the last 10 years. It's been super
Yeah.
helpful for me, but overall I try to not reread books because I like the idea, less the comfort of the reread and more the idea of like, here's something I learned.
Right. Yeah. So I reread for comfort. I think that there's something that is, well, I know how it ends, so it takes the tension out of it. But I think that you get something different every time you reread it, especially if you wait a long time between rereads. So a lot of them was I read this when I was 14, and I really want to view it through adult eyes because we change over time and I am not the person I was when I was 35, let alone 14, 15. So that's been really eye opening. My tastes have changed over time, and you pick up something different every time you read a book too, not just the facts but the impressions you get. You have a much, like, as an adult reading a book written by an adult, you have more insight. Even some of the jokes were just over the head, and I'm like, oh, that's what he meant. Like, if you're a kid, I don't know if you remember the Beetlejuice cartoon,
Yeah, of
but
course. I was a huge
okay,
Beetlejuice fan.
so there were definitely two levels of jokes in that. And there was one because it was targeted for children, right? It was on early in the morning before school. We're watching it. But if you were an adult, there was like this whole other level of jokes that were just for you. And I was like, so rereading a book, you do get that second chance to get what the writer actually wanted you to get out of it. So I do reread some, but not a lot, because I mean, my to be read pile would reach the vacuum of space. It's embarrassingly tall. So
I recently read a
it's
book that I know you also read called This Is How You Lose the Time War. And I will tell you, it was one of the first books that I've read in a long time where I read the whole thing. And the whole time I was wondering, what the hell am I reading? And I was sort of left with this memory of like, oh, I read this really beautiful book about queer love across space and time. And in that respect, it was like very beautifully done. But throughout the entire book, I was like, what am I reading? And it was one
yeah,
of the
what's
only times I've ever read a book like where I left the
the
experience thinking, wow, this was an incredible experience, not having felt that once throughout the entire course of the read.
Yeah, that was an interesting book, and I think that I had a. Uh, it was odd because I was having deja vu reading it. There was a book that was kind of similar that I had read a few years earlier, and it was, I forget what it was called, but it's by Sylvain Newell. He's
I know the author.
Canadian. Oh, you do know the
Yeah.
author? So, have you read the first of the trilogy,
No.
where it's basically two agents chasing each other across time, and neither of them can remember why they're doing it, but they just know that it's imperative that they do this thing. So it had a lot, like the Venn diagram had significant overlap between the two books, but while I was reading it, I'm like, oh, this is a lot like this, but it's not quite the same. It's a different book, but you know. Yeah, I like reading actually the small, like the writers that you've never heard of. Like I'm a huge fan of Quantum. The author known as Quantum, he wrote a book called There Is No um something something division. There is no, anyway, the book is absolutely brilliant. I want everyone to read it. I think it should be talked about in the same language that Blind Sight is talked about on Reddit. Uh, I think it's there is no anti-memetics division.
I mean,
I think that's the name.
this is one of those things where you could just send me the book later and I can include it in the show notes and say, hey, this is the book we're referencing right here.
Yeah, it's absolutely phenomenal, and I actually loved it so much I just went to the Amazon store and bought everything he's ever published for my Kindle. It had that much of an impact on me.
Is part of the reason you read so much because it helps you like put together some of these storylines for the tabletop games, or is it just they're completely separate and they just kind of play together because you've got a wild imagination?
Yeah, I think that's a happy accident. No, I read still as an adult like I did when I was a kid. Like I was always reading, and I was the kid. I can remember that being in elementary school and getting in trouble for reading while the teacher was talking because they weren't talking fast enough. Like I needed more stimulation. So I would be reading a book while they were talking, and I would be hearing and processing everything that they said, but I needed to be reading as well. So it's just something that I've always done. Even when I was in university, I had like a huge workload with all of these required readings. But when it came time late in the evening, when I'm winding down, I pull the book out and I just pick up where I left off and I read. And I think that my Goodreads for this year, I'm 38 books read so far this year.
That's impressive. I haven't cleared 30 yet in Goodreads so far this year.
Yeah, it was a good year. I mean, the standard year. I put in as my goal 25 because I think roughly 2 books a month is completely doable for me. And I do travel, like I have downtime on planes and things, so I need something to do, and I don't I'd rather read a book than watch a movie. So that's what I do with my free time. And it does help flesh out storylines for the games that I play and run. But I can get inspiration from anything. Like I can read a news article and get an idea for a game or even different genre. And I think that inspiration can come from the wildest places. And you can throw an idea in front of me and I might miss it. Like, I do remember a story Robert Sawyer, the Canadian science fiction author, said was he's been a subscriber of Science News since he was a teenager, I guess, because when he was a kid, he's like, I'm going to grow up and be a science fiction writer. He entered one of his short stories into a contest for $100 prize when he was like 17 years old and he won. And he's like, that's it. I'm going to just write science fiction and make a living. And he's been talented and lucky enough that he could carve a career out. And he's only been a science fiction author his whole life. But he said that in this one Science News article, they were talking about how there was a picture of a mosquito in a chunk of amber. And they were saying it would be really interesting if you could see what animal the mosquito had drawn blood from and run its DNA and get its genotype, and then you could see, what the diet was and what animals were around. And he read that article and he thought, oh, that's really neat. Another guy read it and wrote Jurassic Park.
Yep.
Because that was how they got the dinosaur blood originally in that book and movie. Was there was a mosquito in amber and they sampled the blood and it came from some kind of dinosaur, and then they cloned it and then they made Jurassic Park. So ideas can come from anywhere. I there's probably things that I've ignored and other things that were kind of that significant for me that I picked up and ran and incorporated it into something that I did. I really can't think of any specific, but I think it's one of those things like we are the sum of all of our experiences. So I might not remember the details of every book I've ever read, but if I finished it, I enjoyed it and it became part of the sum of those experiences for me.
And just to kind of wrap a little bit of this up, is there any piece of advice that you kind of wish everyone knew throughout your, just as a result of all of your breadth of experience and uh, the way you spend your time? Is there just something that you're like, man, I wish everyone knew this?
Yeah, I mean, for jujitsu, it's a long, hard road. There's no rush. Take your time and tap early and tap often because a lot of those injuries that you get early, they may not bother you when you're 30, 35, 40, but when you're approaching 60 and your hip's not working right and your knee makes a funny noise and your elbow dislocates, even when you're defending arm bars, you might wish that you'd have just been a little kinder and gentler on yourself. And as you age, be kind to yourself and give yourself permission to tap to something that you would have escaped from even maybe 5 or, you know, even 2 or 3 or 4 years earlier, because that is something that we will, if we're all lucky enough to have the luxury of getting old and you want to continue in this sport, you have to give yourself permission to not be the guy you were or the girl you were when you were younger. If you want to keep doing it, just keep doing it and be kind to yourselves and be kind to each other. I mean, we're all in this together.
That's wonderful advice. I feel like we could use a little more love in the world.
We really could now more than ever.
Is there anything that you're excited for in the future?
Well, I mean, continuing to teach and train because I still do get that endorphin rush. Like, I love teaching this and I love rolling with my students and seeing them progress. Um, Looking forward to gaming. I'm going to, I just got back from a gaming convention on the weekend. I'm going to one next weekend as well. So that's going to be a good time. That's kind of it. I have lots of things to look forward to. It's hard to say which one I'm most excited about. Some travel coming up, publishing. I finished some big projects recently, so I'll be glad to see them in print. Um, yeah, that's it. I have lots to look forward to. Retirement's probably the big one. Just being able to have the freedom to allocate my time to the things that really I'm really passionate about. I do love my job, but I will also love not getting up to do my job.
Fair enough. Every good journey has an end. Um,
Yes,
is
indeed. You've leveled up.
Yeah.
You get experience for that.
Is there anything that you'd like to promote?
No, people, if people want to look me up on LinkedIn, I'm my name, Bryan Rumble. On Instagram, it's Bryan.Rumble. It's a lot of jujitsu, gaming, books, craft beer, watches, things that I'm interested in. I'm on Facebook as well, so you can look me up. I teach, the club's called the Rumble Academy. You can follow. I do techniques sometimes, but it's mostly just a vehicle to keep in contact with my students and give them a place that they can always get in contact with me. That's about it.
All right. Well,
This was really fun. Thanks for the opportunity.
yeah, I mean, thanks for taking the time to chat. I really enjoyed this chat, and I'm looking forward to learning a bit more about you in the future.
Excellent. Thanks.
Thank you.
Same. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you have any questions about tabletop games, running BJJ gauntlets for new students, clinical cancer research and genital urinary cancers, or just want to talk about BJJ or science fiction, feel free to reach out to Bryan through any of the social channels. If you find yourself near Ontario, Canada, you can always visit him at the Rumble Academy. You can find the contact information, books, and websites that we talked about in the show notes. And as always, thank you for your time and attention.